Picture this: a single candle flickers in the darkness, casting long shadows across the damp stone walls of a prison cell. The air is thick with the scent of ink and desperation as trembling fingers clutch a quill, scratching words onto fragile parchment. These aren't just any words, they're confessions, pleas, and revelations penned by someone who once stood at the heart of power, now reduced to a prisoner. These letters, hidden away for centuries, didn't just survive, they became the unraveling thread of an empire. How could something as simple as ink and paper hold the power to expose the crumbling foundations of a civilization? This is the story of how the most personal moments of despair, scribbled in secrecy, became the most damning evidence of an empire's collapse. These prison letters aren't just historical artifacts, they're time capsules of human emotion, capturing the fear, betrayal, and bureaucratic decay that gnawed at the empire from within. They reveal the voices of those who saw the end coming, who whispered warnings no one heeded, and today we're going to follow their words step by step as they lead us through the labyrinth of power, loyalty, and ultimate downfall. What makes these letters so extraordinary isn't just what they say, it's what they represent. They're proof that history isn't just written by the victors or the powerful. Sometimes it's written by the forgotten, the imprisoned, the ones who had nothing left to lose. Their words are a window into the soul of an empire in its final days, showing us the cracks that no official chronicle would dare to record. So settle in, because this isn't just a tale of politics or war, it's a story of people, their hopes, their fears, and the fragile threads that hold even the mightiest civilizations together. By the end, you'll see history and power in a way you never have before. At its height, this empire was a dazzling tapestry of ambition and achievement, stretching across continents like no civilization before it. Imagine vast cities where scholars debated philosophy under marble arches, where merchants traded spices from lands so distant their names sounded like poetry. Its armies were undefeated, its treasuries overflowed with gold, and its engineers built wonders that defied the limits of human imagination. But beneath this glittering surface, the very systems that fueled its rise carried the seeds of its destruction. Take its governance, a complex web of provinces ruled by distant governors, all answering to a single absolute monarch. This centralized power kept order, but it also meant every decision, every rebellion, every grain shortage became a crisis for the throne alone to solve. The empire's legendary roads, once symbols of unity, became highways for corruption as local officials grew rich while peasants starved. Even its military, the unstoppable force that carved out an empire, became a liability when endless wars drained its coffers and stretched its loyalties thin. Then there were the cultural triumphs that masked deeper fractures. The empire prided itself on absorbing diverse peoples, yet it never truly unified them. Conquered lands paid taxes and obeyed laws, but their resentment simmered beneath grand monuments and forced loyalty oaths. And while its scholars produced breathtaking advances in science and art, the ruling elite grew disconnected from the struggles of ordinary citizens, too busy debating abstract ideals to notice the hunger in the streets. Most dangerously, the empire's economy thrived on expansion. New lands meant new slaves, new resources, new markets. But like a fire that consumes everything in its path, this model couldn't last forever. When the borders finally stopped growing, the entire system began to crumble. The prisons filled with debtors, the armies mutinied over unpaid wages, and the emperor's court became a nest of paranoia where whispers of treason lurked behind every silk curtain. This was the empire the prison letters would later expose, not in its moment of collapse, but in its golden age when its flaws were already writing its epitaph. The letters didn't cause the fall. They merely recorded what happened when the myths of permanence met the reality of human frailty. Every line of ink on those pages would one day prove that even the mightiest empires are just stories we tell ourselves, stories that can unravel with a single truth, hastily scribbled in the dark. For centuries, these fragile pages lay forgotten, not in some grand imperial archive, but in the most unlikely of places. Some were tucked inside the crumbling walls of a remote monastery, hidden between the leaves of religious texts to avoid destruction. Others survived because a lowly prison guard, moved by pity or perhaps rebellion, secretly passed them to the prisoner's family instead of burning them as ordered. A few even resurfaced centuries later, discovered by sheer accident when a farmer digging a well struck not water, but a rusted iron box containing letters still legible despite the damp and the dark. The real turning point came when a sharp-eyed scholar in the 19th century, sifting through a mountain of dusty manuscripts in an old library, noticed something peculiar. The handwriting didn't match the official records surrounding it. It was too rushed, too personal. The ink was faded, but the emotion in the words was unmistakable. These weren't dry administrative reports. They were raw, unfiltered cries from the edge of oblivion. Once authenticated, they ignited a firestorm among historians. Some dismissed them as forgeries or exaggerations, while others recognized them for what they were, a rare, unvarnished look behind the empire's crumbling facade. Debates raged over every smudged word. Were these the ramblings of desperate minds or deliberate testimonies meant to outlive their writers? The letters contradicted official histories, which portrayed the empire's decline as sudden and inevitable. Instead, they revealed a slow rot, tax collectors pocketing funds meant for the army, governors selling grain reserves during famines, even emperors receiving warnings of rebellion and dismissing them as court gossip. Perhaps most astonishing was how these scattered fragments, written in isolation, formed a cohesive narrative when pieced together. A nobleman's plea from one prison matched a general's confession from another, both describing the same broken systems. A merchant's smuggled letter warning of economic collapse echoed a poet's lament about cultural decay. Like shards of a shattered mirror, each fragment reflected a different angle of the same truth. Their journey from obscurity to revelation wasn't just luck, it was a testament to the stubbornness of truth. Burned, buried, or banished, these letters endured because they carried something too powerful to erase, the human voice refusing to be silenced even as the walls closed in. And now, centuries later, they speak to us not as dry history, but as a warning, one scribbled in haste, sealed in desperation, and delivered across time. The names signed at the bottom of these prison letters read like a roll call of the empire's sole generals who once commanded thousands, now begging for mercy, tax collectors who enriched the state, now accused of stealing from it, poets who celebrated imperial glory, now writing its elegy. Each writer's story is a thread in the tapestry of the empire's unraveling. Take the case of a provincial governor whose elegant handwriting fills 3 pages with frantic justifications. A decade earlier, he'd been a rising star, handpicked to administer a wealthy region. But when harvests failed and unrest grew, his letters to the capital pleading for aid went unanswered. Desperate, he diverted grain reserves to feed the starving, only to be arrested for treasonous redistribution. His final letter, smuggled out by a sympathetic guard, doesn't defend his actions. Instead, it asks one haunting question. When loyalty to the people becomes a crime, what remains of the empire's purpose? Then there's the soldier's confession, scrawled in uneven lines as if written in haste. A career officer stationed at a remote frontier fort, he describes watching his garrison's pay arrive months late, then halved, then stopped altogether. When his men began deserting, he looked the other way until he was charged with negligence. His ink-stained pages recount the bitter irony. We were punished not for abandoning our posts, but for expecting the empire to keep its promises. Nearby, archaeologists found his rusted helmet, buried with the letter still folded inside. But perhaps most revealing are the words of a court philosopher, once the emperor's favorite intellectual. His crime, writing a private essay questioning whether the empire's endless wars were eroding its moral authority. Arrested during a purge of subversive thinkers, his prison letters shift from scholarly detachment to raw anguish. In one, he compares the empire to a grand bridge. The engineers swore it would stand forever, but no one inspected the cracks beneath the paint. His final message, written with a makeshift quill, simply reads, "Truth is the guest no palace welcomes twice." What binds these voices together isn't just their shared fate, it's how their alleged crimes mirror the empire's decline. The governor's treason exposed a bureaucracy too rigid to adapt. The soldier's negligence revealed a military stretched beyond its means. The philosopher's heresy laid bare an elite too fearful to confront hard truths. These weren't random victims, they were symptoms of a system that could no longer distinguish between dissent and diagnosis. Their letters, once dismissed as the ravings of the condemned, now read like a chorus of warnings, voices the empire silenced, only to have them speak louder across the centuries. Betrayal drips from these pages like ink bleeding through parchment, not just personal betrayals, but institutional ones. A high-ranking officer's letter, its edges frayed from anxious handling, recounts how his own troops turned him over to imperial investigators after he refused orders to burn a rebellious village. They called it duty, he writes, but when the state rewards obedience over conscience, loyalty becomes a knife pointed at every honest man's throat. His words expose a chilling truth. The empire's greatest strength, its rigid chain of command, had become its fatal weakness. When promotion depended on blind compliance rather than moral judgment, the system bred not loyalty but opportunism. Even more devastating are the accounts of families torn apart. A merchant's daughter, imprisoned for her father's debts, describes how relatives she once sheltered denounced her to claim his confiscated property. Her shaky script reveals the depth of the wound. When hunger grips a house, love starves first. This wasn't mere cruelty. It was a symptom of an economy so broken that survival required sacrificing kinship. Historians later traced similar stories across provinces, where tax policies incentivized reporting neighbors and even kin for minor infractions, eroding the social fabric that held communities together. Then there's the betrayal of ideals. A former judge's letter, written on smuggled parchment, details how he sentenced innocent farmers to forced labor to meet provincial quotas. The law once meant justice, he confesses, but now it's just a ledger where lives balance budgets. His despair mirrors dozens of other accounts where officials educated to uphold justice found themselves enforcing policies they knew were corrupt. The empire's legal system, designed to unify diverse territories under shared principles, had degenerated into a tool for extraction. Perhaps most telling is how often the word promise appears in these letters, broken promises of pay for soldiers, protection for citizens, fairness for officials. A blacksmith conscripted into the army writes of waiting 7 months for wages that never came, only to discover his commander had pocketed the funds. His crude handwriting captures the moment trust died. They took our labor, then our faith. What's left to take but the empire itself? These betrayals weren't isolated incidents, they were feedback loops. Each broken vow made the next one easier, until honor became a relic no one could afford. The letters show how systems meant to bind the empire together instead taught its people that no covenant, military, economic, or moral, was sacred. When survival depends on betrayal, collapse isn't an event. It's a habit. The prison letters peel back the gilded facade of imperial administration to reveal a nightmare of bureaucratic decay, a system so tangled in its own rules that it strangled the empire it was meant to serve. One tax collector's desperate scribbles describe warehouses overflowing with unprocessed petitions, some so old the ink had faded before they were read. "We stamped them reviewed just to clear space," he admits, while peasants starved waiting for relief that never came. His confession matches archaeological finds, entire archives of untouched petitions discovered centuries later, still sealed with the wax of long-dead officials. This wasn't mere inefficiency, it was institutional paralysis. A regional administrator's letter details how a simple request to repair a vital bridge required 17 approvals across 4 provinces, while the river below swallowed entire villages each flood season. By the time the last seal was pressed, he writes, the bridge was already rubble and so were the homes downstream. Compare this to the empire's golden age, when governors could dispatch engineers within hours of a disaster. The difference: earlier rulers empowered local solutions, while later regimes obsessed with control created labyrinths of accountability where no one took responsibility. The letters expose corruption's chokehold with brutal clarity. A quartermaster's smuggled note reveals how military supplies vanished into a shadow economy. For every 10 swords shipped north, 3 reached the troops. The rest sold back to blacksmiths to forge again, profit recycled like a snake eating its tail. Official records from the same period oddly list full shipments, proving how falsified paperwork sustained the illusion of order. Even justice became transactional. A judge's private letter boasts of dismissing cases against wealthy merchants, not for gold, but for the favor of their trade routes. Most damning are the accounts of bureaucratic survivalism. As rebellions erupted, officials burned incriminating records rather than send reinforcements. Better to lose a province than admit failure, writes a clerk tasked with doctoring population counts after a plague. The empire's famed census, once a marvel of organization, became fiction governors inflating numbers to mask decline, ensuring their promotions while the state budget crumbled under false data. Historians now see these letters as autopsy reports for a system that prioritized process over purpose. The empire didn't collapse because it lacked knowledge or resources. It fell because its bureaucracy rewarded pretense over problem solving. A lowly scribe's summation cuts deepest. We weren't governed, we were archived. The ink stains on these prison letters tell more than just words, they tell of hunger. One official's shaky handwriting describes opening the imperial granaries only to find them full of dust and rats, while outside, mobs clawed at the gates for bread. "We weighed coins instead of grain," he writes, and called it accounting. This wasn't just scarcity, it was the unraveling of an entire economic system. Soldiers' letters beg for back pay in desperate loops of ink, their words mirroring excavations of barracks where archaeologists later found stacks of paid chits, worthless promises scrawled on crumbling parchment. A merchant's smuggled note calculates how prices for wheat had risen 1,000-fold in a decade, adding bitterly, "A man could trade his cloak for a loaf at dawn and his shoes for crumbs by dusk." The roots of this collapse ran deeper than bad harvests. A tax collector's confession reveals how the empire bled its provinces dry to fund endless wars, then compounded the crisis by debasing its currency. "We shaved silver from coins until they were thin as leaves," he admits, and wondered why traders spat at them. Historians tracing these claims found hordes of slashed coins buried across the empire, their edges nicked by merchants testing their worth. Even the wealthy weren't spared. A noblewoman's plea describes melting her family's gold plates to bribe officials, only to be handed counterfeit receipts. "When money loses meaning," she scrawls, "so do oaths." What makes these accounts so chilling is their familiarity. A dockworker's letter lists ships rotting in harbor because tariffs made trade impossible, while a farmer's barely literate scrawl tells of fields left fallow when seed taxes exceeded harvest profits. These weren't isolated hardships but symptoms of an economy cannibalizing itself. The empire had built its glory on conquest and plunder, but when expansion stalled, it turned inward, taxing productivity into oblivion while elites hoarded wealth in palaces. One bureaucrat's private journal, hidden between prison walls, captures the absurdity. "We taxed the rope makers, then wondered why no one could hang the thieves." The letters also expose how economic rot fueled social disintegration. A widow's petition, its edges frayed from handling, recounts selling her children into servitude to pay a land assessment. Nearby, a priest's angry missive condemns church leaders for buying up debtors' properties at starvation prices. Even the military, once the empire's backbone, became a predator. A garrison's payroll ledger, later found buried beneath a fort, shows soldiers extorting protection fees from the villages they were sworn to defend. Yet the most damning revelations concern not cruelty, but waste. A disgraced treasurer's notes detail lavish festivals funded with emergency grain reserves while provinces starved. "We gilded our despair," he writes, "and called it prosperity." This disconnect between reality and spectacle became the empire's death knell. When archaeologists uncovered a governor's banquet hall centuries later, they found receipts for wine shipments dated the same week as famine reports, a physical echo of the letter's outrage. These accounts form a mosaic of economic suicide where short-term greed strangled long-term survival. The empire didn't just run out of money, it ran out of trust. A money changer's final letter, penned before his execution for spreading panic, sums it up. When a coin buys less than the ink to protest its worth, empires become pyres. His words, like so many others, were meant to burn. Instead, they became a mirror, one that still reflects the peril of power divorced from consequence. The letters paint a startling picture: once disciplined legions reduced to ragged bands of desperate men, their loyalty eroded by empty promises and empty stomachs. A captain's plea for supplies, its ink smeared with what might be tears, describes soldiers boiling leather straps for broth while their commanders dined on roasted peacock. "We guarded borders with spears in our hands and hunger in our bellies," he writes, "until the day we realized no one was guarding us." His words mirrored dozens of others, all revealing how the empire's military might unravel thread by thread. At first, the cracks were small. A quartermaster's ledger from a frontier fort lists delayed pay shipments, each entry growing terser as the months passed. Then came the substitutions: cheaper armor, thinner cloaks, grain shipments mixed with sawdust to stretch supplies. But when soldiers began deserting not to the enemy, but to nearby farms just to eat, the rot reached bone deep. A general's furious dispatch orders the execution of an entire unit that abandoned its post, only to add in a shaky postscript: the executioners refused. Even discipline had become negotiable when loyalty no longer fed families. The letters expose leadership failures with brutal clarity. A young officer's account describes receiving orders from a newly appointed commander, a political favorite who had never set foot on a battlefield. He demanded we charge uphill into archers, the officer scrawls, then fled when we asked how. Such incompetence wasn't rare. Promotion had shifted from merit to connections, turning the officer corps into a playground for aristocrats seeking prestige without risk. Meanwhile, veteran commanders who protested found themselves reassigned to swamp garrisons or accused of treason. A single sentence from a demoted strategist captures the absurdity. They called us defenders of the realm, then punished us for knowing how. Supply chains became another fatal weakness. A quartermaster's frantic note lists 3 failed harvests, stolen wagon trains, and warehouses where rats starved. I report shortages, he writes, and they send auditors instead of grain. Archaeologists later found evidence confirming his claims, abandoned forts with storage rooms containing nothing but broken seals and mouse bones. The Empire's legendary roads, once its lifeline, now ferried chaos as local warlords and bandits intercepted shipments with impunity. A cavalryman's bitter joke survives in one letter: "Our scouts ride out. If they return, we eat. If not, we guess." Worst of all was the betrayal of the veterans, a disabled legionary's petition, its edges worn from handling, begs for the pension promised after 20 years of service. The response, scribbled in bureaucratic shorthand at the bottom, reads simply, "No record found." His story wasn't unique. Muster rolls from the period show thousands discharged without pay, their names later purged from records to hide the debt. Some turned to banditry, others sold their swords to rebel factions. A provincial governor's warning to the capital puts it plainly: when you treat soldiers like beggars, they stop saluting and start sharpening blades. The consequences rippled outward. Frontier tribes, long held at bay by the Empire's reputation alone, began testing undefended borders. A scout's report describes watching invaders stroll through unmanned watchtowers, laughing as they kicked open doors we hadn't the strength to guard. Diplomatic missives grew increasingly frantic, offering gold and titles to chieftains who had once trembled at Rome's name, but the letters reveal the truth: bribes couldn't replace respect. A mercenary captain's boast to his employer survives in a captured dispatch. They pay in silver, but their fear is the real currency. By the end, the military's collapse became self-fulfilling. Towns stopped reporting raids, knowing no help would come. Recruiters found villages emptied of fighting-age men. Some drafted, others fled. A single line from a border garrison's logbook, dated just before its abandonment, sums up the tragedy. First watch, silence. Last watch, silence. Forever watch, broken. The Empire hadn't just lost its army, it had broken the covenant that bound soldiers to the state. And as the letters show, once that trust dissolves, not even walls as tall as mountains can keep the darkness out. The prison letters don't just document political collapse, they sing the Empire's cultural elegy in voices thick with grief. A poet, imprisoned for reciting verses deemed unpatriotic, describes walking past the ruins of a once great library, its scrolls scattered like fallen leaves. They burned the books to warm the palace baths, he writes, and called it progress. His words capture a chilling truth: when a civilization turns on its own heritage, it's already begun digging its grave. Festivals that had united generations became casualties of neglect. A musician's letter, smudged with wine stains, recounts the last performance at the Imperial Theatre, a half-empty hall where actors stumbled through lines no one remembered. "We used to rehearse for months," he laments. "Now they hand us scripts an hour before curtain and wonder why the crowd throws rotten fruit." The decay wasn't just artistic, it was spiritual. A priest's clandestine note confesses that temple ceremonies had been shortened to accommodate merchant fairs, with sacred hymns replaced by bawdy drinking songs. "The gods left first," he scrawls. "We just failed to notice. The erosion cut deepest in education. a philosopher's smuggled treatise mourns the closing of rural schools where peasant children once studied poetry alongside farming. They took the lyres from classrooms and said arithmetic was enough, he writes. Now we have accountants who can't spell their own names. Excavations later confirmed his claims village schools repurposed as grain stores, their walls still bearing faded alphabet exercises. Even elite academies weren't spared. A tutor's desperate plea to a former student describes lectures interrupted by soldiers demanding tribute. They taxed the ink in our wells, then wondered why no one wrote epics anymore. Language itself became a battleground. Letters from border regions show imperial dialects fracturing into local slang, with official decrees misunderstood as nonsense. A scribe's panicked dispatch complains that legal documents had to be translated 3 times before even judges grasped their meaning. We conquered the world with one tongue, he frets, and lost it to 1,000 whispers. This wasn't mere linguistic drift, it was the unraveling of a shared identity. Artifacts tell the same story, where archaeologists find Golden Age murals bursting with color and life. Late-period art shrivels into crude caricatures, portraits of emperors with identical, soulless faces stamped like coins. A painter's prison sketch hidden inside a hollowed-out bread loaf captures the absurdity. Blank canvases pre-signed by censors, awaiting approved subjects that never came. The most heartbreaking losses were the quiet ones. A grandmother's letter to her exiled grandson includes a lullaby she fears he'll never teach his children. They say these old tunes are backward now, she writes, but what's forward but a cliff? Her question haunts because it wasn't metaphorical. The empire had literally forgotten how to make the dyes for its legendary purple robes, the ceramic glazes for its fine pottery, even the recipes for its victory feasts. This cultural amnesia didn't just accompany political failure, it accelerated it. When a society stops believing its stories are worth preserving, it loses the will to defend them. A diplomat's intercepted report describes barbarian chiefs mocking imperial envoys for misquoting their own laws. They used to fear our memory, he admits. Now they pity it. The letters reveal a bitter irony. The empire's leaders, desperate to project strength, had gutted the very culture that made their rule legitimate. In the end, the most damning indictment comes from a child's practice slate, unearthed near a prison's ruins. Scratched beside grammar exercises is a single line, perhaps copied from a lost poem. We were giants once. Who shrunk us? The answer, whispered across hundreds of prison letters, is clear. A civilization that abandons its soul to keep its shell soon finds it has neither. When hope withered like crops in a drought, the prisoner's hands reached not for swords or coins, but for gods old and new. A once skeptical general's letter, stained with candle wax, confesses nightly prayers to a war deity he'd mocked in his youth. I called them superstitions until the night I heard barbarian drums where no army stood. His trembling script mirrors dozens of others where hardened men, logicians, soldiers, bureaucrats scratched desperate bargains with divine forces they'd long ignored. Offerings promised for deliverance read like twisted trade contracts, a lifetime of piety for one more dawn. The letters reveal spiritual whiplash. A tax collector's meticulous records abruptly give way to frenzied invocations scribbled between columns of debt pleas to agricultural gods for harvests the empire's policies had ruined. Elsewhere, a philosopher's measured treatise on astronomy ends mid-page, replaced by a childlike drawing of outstretched hands reaching for the stars. Even atheists faltered. One magistrate's defiant proclamation that gods are but shadows of our fears is followed 5 pages later by a list of sacrifices made at a roadside shrine. Temples became battlegrounds of doubt. A priest's smuggled letter describes crowds abandoning state-sanctioned rituals for underground cults promising salvation. They kneel before our altars by day, he writes, but by night they whisper the names of foreign saviors. Official reports dismissed these movements as peasant hysterics, but the prison letters tell a darker truth: the empire's spiritual monopoly was crumbling. A captured cult leader's interrogation transcript, copied secretly by his jailer, contains a prophetic jab. You built roads to conquer lands, but forgot they'd carry new gods back. Theological certainties unraveled under crisis. A bishop's private notes, hidden inside his prison tunic, agonize over explaining plagues and defeats to his flock. When I call suffering divine mystery, their eyes glaze like starving men told to eat my words. Contrast this with a farmer's curse tablet dredged from a well, a lead sheet etched with crude runes blaming the emperor's sinful pride for failed reigns. Both texts, though worlds apart, ask the same agonizing question. If rulers claimed divine mandate, why did heaven permit collapse? Some saw doom as purification. A mystic's charcoal scrawled visions describe the empire as a rotten fruit the gods will pluck to save the tree. His jailers dismissed him as mad, but his imagery spread. Archaeologists later found similar phrases scrawled on barracks walls and market stalls. Even practical minds succumbed. An engineer's blueprint for a siege engine is overlaid with zodiac symbols, as if celestial alignment mattered more than timber quality. The most poignant documents are the unfinished prayers. A mother's letter to her conscripted son breaks off mid-sentence, her final words not a farewell but an incantation. By the mercy of every listening power, let this reach you. The parchment shows no further ink, just a long smear where her hand must have faltered. Nearby digs uncovered amulets buried under prison thresholds, each containing snippets of letters, words meant to protect what the empire could not. This spiritual chaos wasn't just personal despair, it was systemic failure. When official religion served the state rather than souls, it left hollowed-out rituals that couldn't withstand real suffering. A dissident priest's summation, smuggled out in a bread loaf, cuts deep. They taught us God's crowned emperors, but never warned what happens when the gods stop watching. The prison letters prove that civilizations don't just fall by sword or famine. They perish when the stories that held them together lose their power to comfort or condemn. The most heartbreaking letters aren't the ones cursing emperors or plotting rebellions, they're the ones that never mention politics at all. A wife's ink-smudged plea to her imprisoned husband survives on a scrap no larger than a palm. The child asks for you every night. What do I tell her? Nearby, archaeologists found his reply, etched into a clay shard with a nail. Say I'm building her a world. The tragedy isn't just that he never came home, it's that he believed his sacrifice mattered. These intimate fragments reveal the human cost of collapse, not in battles or budgets, but in empty cradles and unanswered questions. Yet right beside them lie letters pulsing with fury. A disgraced general's manifesto, smuggled out in a corpse's shroud, lists every imperial betrayal in blood-red ink. You took our sons for your wars, our grain for your feasts, our oaths for your lies. His words aren't grief, they're accusation. Each sentence a hammer strike against the throne's legitimacy. What makes these documents so powerful is their juxtaposition. The empire's fall wasn't just measured in sacked cities or devalued coin. It was counted in broken promises between parents and children, between soldiers and the state they died for. Some writers straddled both worlds. A young clerk's diary begins with poetry to a sweetheart back home, then twists into a coded record of corruption. Darling, today I tallied the missing silver, enough to buy the village you dream of. They call it tax variance, I call it theft. His love letters double as evidence, embedding damning truths between lines of longing. Even the paper betrays this duality. Archivists found traces of saltwater stains atop official wax seals, suggesting documents signed through tears. The letters also expose how personal and political despair fed each other. A widow's petition for her husband's pension, denied 7 times, ends with a threat. If the empire forgets its debts, why should we remember its laws? Her shift from pleading to defiance mirrors broader unrest. Excavated protest placards from the same period recycle phrases found in private letters, proving how private grievances became public rebellions. Most haunting are the voices that never chose sides. A farmer's note tucked inside his executed son's tunic reads simply, "We planted loyalty, they harvested bodies." No demands, no curses, just a truth so raw it needed no adornment. These quiet testimonies cut deeper than any manifesto, because they remind us that history's grand narratives are stitched together with ordinary hearts. Every empire rises on promises to its people, but it's in these unguarded moments between a mother's worry, a lover's lie, a dying man's last joke scratched on a cell wall, that we see the moment those promises snap. The prison letters force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Civilizations don't collapse because of abstract forces like economic decline or military overextension. They crumble when enough individuals stop believing the fiction that holds the system together. A single line from a child's letter to her imprisoned father captures this unraveling better than any historian's thesis. "You said the emperor was good. Then why did he take you?" Some letters arrive too clean, their ink too even, no smudges, no frantic crossings out, as if written by hands trained to hide their shaking. These are the censored ones, where every word wears a mask. A governor's plea for troop reinforcements buries the request between lines praising the emperor's wisdom. As your loyal servant humbly observes, the northern garrisons shine as examples of your benevolence, though perhaps additional examples might further illuminate the frontier. The desperation leaks through not in what's said, but in what's stretched thin between the lines. Coding became survival. A merchant's letter discussing grain shortages uses the same phrasing found in rebel manifestos later unearthed by archaeologists, a shared lexicon of hunger as protest. Elsewhere, a poet's lament about withering gardens mirrors underground pamphlets decrying imperial censorship. Even the spacing betrays fear. One prisoner's letter crowds words at the top of the page, leaving the bottom suspiciously blank. Later forensic scans revealed erased lines condemning the emperor, scraped away before the ink could dry. The prison's own walls taught this dance of concealment. A scribe's note describes guards reading outgoing mail aloud, watching for flinches. They weigh our words like goldsmiths testing for false coin. Writers adapted, turning gossip into farming metaphors, troop movements into weather reports, corruption into recipes gone foul. A cook's letter complaining of spoiled banquet meats was later matched to a general's diary entry about purged officers. These weren't just codes, they were psychological armor, thin but vital. Surveillance bred absurdity. A noblewoman's letter to her sister spends 3 pages describing embroidery patterns before burying the real message in a postscript, P. S. The yellow thread has run out. Archives confirm yellow was rebel sympathizers' secret color. Such convolutions came at a cost. A philosopher's fragmented draft shows him rewriting a single sentence 12 times, each version blander than the last, until all that remained was empty courtesies. "They didn't silence me," his final journal entry admits. "I learned to silence myself, yet the gaps speak loudest." One soldier's letter home stops mid-sentence after mentioning his captain's disappearance, the next paragraph abruptly praising the weather. Forensic scans show no torn edges, just a conscious choice to swallow the rest. Even children learned the art. A girl's thank you note for a birthday gift includes a jarring non sequitur. The doll is lovely, and father says not to worry about the men who took him. The ink darkens on those last words, pressed hard enough to scar the parchment. This self-censorship didn't just hide truth, it rewired minds. A diplomat's draft letters show him progressively replacing concrete details with vague honorifics until his dispatches became meaningless. The situation beyond the river remains, as always, a testament to your infinite wisdom. When historians compared these to captured enemy records, they found the situation was a full-scale invasion. The Empire didn't just lose information, it lost the capacity to recognize disaster. A spy's report from the capital's slums captures the irony. They've stopped whispering treason not from loyalty, but because they've forgotten the words. The letter's greatest revelation isn't what they contain, but what they avoid. No direct critiques, no explicit pleas for rebellion, just a creeping silence where dissent should be. Like a forest stripped of birdsong, the absence itself becomes the warning. A single line from a censor's own journal, unearthed centuries later, admits the truth. We didn't need to burn every dangerous idea. Just teaching men to burn them first was enough. History never collapses in isolation, it echoes. The prison letters of this nameless empire whisper patterns we've heard before in the crumbling halls of Rome, the besieged towers of Byzantium, even the fractured camps of the Mongols. Take overexpansion, that seductive trap of empires. Rome's legions staggered under the weight of borders too vast to defend, just as our letter writers describe forts manned by skeletons in rusted armor. Byzantium's emperors drained treasuries, bribing invaders at the gates, mirroring the desperate bribes scribbled in prison ledgers. Pay the northern chieftain 10 chests of silver, or the roads burn by spring. And like the Mongols, who fractured when the spoils of conquest dried up, this empire's governors turned on each other. One prisoner's letter accuses his rival of hoarding grain while children gnawed on tree bark. Elite infighting follows like a shadow. The late Roman Senate wasted its final years debating whether bronze or marble statues better honored doomed emperors, while our letters reveal officials arguing over ceremonial robes as rebels scaled the city walls. Byzantium's palace coups, emperors blinded, mothers poisoning sons find their parallel in a general's coded warning. The regent's wine tastes of almonds since his nephew returned from exile. Even the Mongols, who prized loyalty above all, succumbed to kinslaying, a pattern echoed here when a prince's letter boasts of his father's sudden illness after denying him troops. Environmental stress weaves through these collapses like a poisonous thread. Rome's aqueducts choked with silt as droughts parched its breadbaskets, just as our scribes describe canals clogged with corpses and wheat fields salted by desperate warlords. Byzantium's plagues emptied cities faster than any invasion, while a healer's prison scroll lists remedies for the black boils that felled entire garrisons. And the Mongols' grassland empires withered when climate shifts starved their horses. Our own letters mourn cavalry mounts slaughtered for meat when the rains failed 7 summers straight. Yet one difference chills awareness. Roman elites wrote elegies for their dying world. Byzantine scholars preserved libraries even as ships burned in the harbor. But our prison letters, they show a unique blindness. A tax collector's ledger from the empire's final year still tallies imaginary harvests, while a general's dispatches describe temporary setbacks as enemies torch supplied depots. This wasn't just denial, it was systemic delusion where admitting weakness became the greatest treason of all. The cruelest lesson lies in timing. Rome endured centuries of decline, Byzantium flickered for generations. But this empire, its letters suggest collapse came not with a slow dimming but a snapped thread. One season, officials debate tax reforms. The next, their bartering signet rings for bread. Like a bridge standing intact until the last rusted rivet pops, the illusion of stability held until the moment it didn't. A single line from a clerk's final message haunts. We were still writing the reports when the gates gave way. The prison letters scream of barbarian hordes, their names etched in ink like curses, but dig deeper, and a far more revealing story emerges. A governor's frantic dispatch describes northern raiders torching villages, yet buried in the margins is a confession. The watchtowers stood empty, their garrisons recalled to crush a tax revolt. This wasn't just invasion, it was a grotesque game of dominoes where every internal misstep toppled another line of defense. The empire's enemies didn't create its weakness, they exploited cracks that had been widening for generations. Take the famed Scourge of the East described in the letters, a warlord whose armies supposedly appeared like locusts, but a captured scout's interrogation transcript tells another tale. We tracked their movements for months, sending warnings. The capital replied our couriers were exaggerating to justify budgets. By the time the empire mobilized, the warlord's forces had already recruited half its starving border troops. A siege engineer's letter captures the absurdity. They mocked us for fearing the battering ram outside the gates, while termites gnawed the hinges from within. The letters reveal a pattern of scapegoating. A treasurer's scroll blames foreign pirates for empty coffers, yet itemizes 6 pages of embezzled naval funds. A general's report claims savage ambushes wiped out his legion, but a survivor's smuggled note tells the truth. We marched for 3 days without water because the supply officer sold our rations. Even climate disasters got reframed as foreign plots. A drought that sparked famine was attributed to enemy weather mages in official decrees, while the letters of provincial farmers simply note, the irrigation channels silted up years ago. No one came to dig. This blame shifting had lethal consequences. A border commander's plea for reinforcements was denied because the capital insisted the real threat was spies in the Senate. By the time the invaders arrived, his fort's walls hadn't been repaired in a decade. Archaeologists later found his skeleton still clutching a ledger showing 12 rejected maintenance requests. The empire's obsession with phantom traitors blinded it to tangible dangers. Like a man so busy barricading his windows, he never noticed the foundation crumbling. Yet the letters also expose uncomfortable truths about the so-called barbarians. A merchant's account of being plundered by raiders includes an awkward detail. The attackers paid him for grain with silver stamped from the imperial mint, likely bribes from corrupt officials. Another describes watching invaders distribute looted grain to starving villagers, asking, "Who's the real thief here?" Even military encounters defied propaganda. A soldier's letter home admits his unit found supposed savages better equipped than they were. Their smiths reforged our broken swords while our armories sold theirs for scrap. The most damning evidence comes from the invaders themselves. Scrolls captured from enemy camps, often dismissed as propaganda, mirror the prisoners' letters with eerie precision. One chieftain's taunt to his troops survived on a leather banner. They fear our swords, but it's their own mirrors that cut deepest. Another mocks imperial envoys for offering gold with one hand while their other hand starved the people who might have defended them. These weren't mindless destroyers, they were opportunists playing a rigged game where the empire had stacked the deck against itself. In the end, the letters force us to confront a brutal symmetry. The empire's borders didn't fall because outsiders were uniquely strong, but because the empire made itself uniquely weak. A philosopher's final scribble before execution frames it best. When you spend centuries building cages for your own people, don't be surprised when someone else holds the key. The invaders weren't the disease, they were the fever that revealed how long the infection had been festering. The prison letters don't just speak of political betrayal or military decay. They gasp for breath in air thick with dust, their ink smudged by hands cracked from thirst. A tax collector's ledger from the empire's final years lists not just missing coins but missing rains. Third year without Nile floods, peasants paid in husks and despair. Nearby, a farmer's plea scrawled on a broken roof tile begs relief from grain taxes after locusts blackened his fields. These aren't just complaints, they're climate autopsies, matching tree ring studies showing decades of megadroughts that turned bread baskets to wastelands. Archaeologists tracing these accounts made grim discoveries. Wells dug deeper and deeper through strata of dry earth, their walls notched like measuring sticks of desperation. Granaries built to hold 5 years of harvest stood empty, their floors littered with rodent bones, evidence of populations so hungry they hunted creatures that themselves had starved. A soldier's letter from a frontier outpost describes drinking from puddles while sand dunes swallowed watchtowers whole. The desert moves faster than our reinforcements. Satellite imagery now confirms his claim ancient border forts half buried by shifting sands that once lay miles away. The letters expose a bureaucracy blind to ecological reality. A governor's report boasts of record tax collections from farmlands that, according to pollen samples, had already become scrubland. Another official's scroll orders celebrations for another bountiful year, while carbon-dated cattle bones from the same period show signs of starvation. This wasn't just denial, it was systemic delusion where admitting environmental crisis meant admitting failure. A hydrologist smuggled notes put it bluntly. They kept building aqueducts to rivers that no longer flowed. Yet some writers connected the dots. A poet imprisoned for seditious verse describes watching elite gardens flourish with imported water while children licked dew off stones. The statues still hold urns, but their hands are dry as our throats. His metaphor finds chilling validation in ice core data, showing precipitation patterns collapsing just as wealth disparity spiked. Even faith buckled under the strain. A priest's letter confesses temple offerings switched from gold to water jugs with the note, "The gods seem thirstier than we are." The cruelest irony lies in the empire's own role. Deforestation records match angry petitions about timber barons stripping mountains bare, while an engineer's draft warns that cleared slopes accelerated erosion. We flood when it rains, starve when it doesn't. Modern soil analysis proves him right. Valleys that fed millions now layered with silt from preventable landslides. A single line from a dying farmer's last message cuts deepest. They took the trees, then wondered why the sky stopped crying. These personal accounts transform dry climate data into human tragedy. When archaeologists unearth mass graves from the empire's final century, the skeletons tell the same story as the letters. Children's bones stunted by malnutrition, elderly remains with arthritic knees from hauling water miles further each year. A midwife's desperate recipe scroll lists grass and clay as famine foods, her ink blotted with what might be tears. Nearby digs found pottery shards bearing those same gruel residues, proof that the worst fears in those prison cells had teeth. What makes these records so haunting isn't just their accuracy, it's their helpless foresight. A young scholar's smuggled thesis predicts desertification decades before it peaked, complete with sketches of terraces that could have saved topsoil. His jailer's note at the bottom reads, "Sentence doubled for spreading despair." The empire didn't lack knowledge, it lacked the courage to face what it knew. As modern researchers overlay these written warnings with geological evidence, one pattern chills: the louder the truth screamed in those prison letters, the faster the wax seals came down to silence them. The empire's official scrolls gleamed with polished lies, pages of triumph where defeats were rewritten as strategic withdrawals, famines recast as austerity measures, and rebellions dismissed as bandit raids. Yet in the prison letters, reality bleeds through the parchment like a wound that won't close. A censor's own secret journal admits the charade. We scratch out retreat and write redeployment until even our pens grow weary of the deceit. This wasn't just spin, it was a collective hallucination enforced by ink and seal, where dissent became the only remaining truth teller. The mechanics of this deception reveal a brittle brilliance. Take the imperial gazettes distributed monthly to every province, their elegant calligraphy proclaiming bumper harvests and loyal subjects. But a clerk's smuggled notes exposed the process. We received the harvest numbers blank. The minister filled them in himself, laughing about the peasants who'd forgotten to starve properly. Archaeologists later found the proof, grain silos from that era containing nothing but rat droppings and the occasional child's skeleton. The letters show how propaganda relied on isolation. Villages were told their suffering was unique, their neighbors thriving. A farmer's plea to his brother in the next valley survives, its shock palpable. You too. They told us you were feasting. Dissenting voices weaponized the empire's own infrastructure against it. The famed road network, built to speed imperial decrees, carried subversive songs instead. A musician's prison confession describes teaching ballads with coded lyrics to merchant caravans. Let the taxmen hear a love song, only the hungry know it's about them. Even children became conduits. A schoolmaster's letter boasts how pupils memorized rebel poetry disguised as multiplication rhymes. They sing it in the courtyards, he writes, while the prefects nod along to the beat. The most damning evidence lies in what the letters don't say. Official histories mention temporary unrest in the 12th year of Emperor Theodoric's reign. But a midwife's diary from that same year, hidden inside a hollowed-out loom, lists stillbirths from hunger with a chilling refrain: no milk, no tears left either. The disconnect wasn't accidental, it was policy. A provincial governor's intercepted order mandates burning any document mentioning the Troubles, adding, "Let the record show only spring after spring." Yet reality has a way of seeping through the cracks. A soldier's letter home, stamped, approved by censors, seems innocuous until you notice the stains, not ink, but berry juice used as makeshift invisible writing. Held to flame, the parchment reveals his true message. They're feeding us sawdust bread. The officers eat mutton and call it loyalty. Such ingenuity flourished in the margins. A tapestry merchant's ledger, its columns of wool shipments perfectly mundane, contained a second ledger woven into the fabric's reverse side, a meticulous record of troop movements for rebel forces. What finally broke the spell wasn't confrontation, but exhaustion. A bureaucrat's draft speech for the emperor, never delivered, admits the truth between its polished lines. When every man must lie to live, even kings lose the thread of their own tales. The letters capture the precise moment when propaganda collapsed under its own weight, when a people who'd been told nothing was wrong realized everything was. A single phrase scratched on a prison wall and later found repeated in tavern bills and wedding contracts across the empire says it all. The truth fits no imperial seal. Among the prison letters, the voices of women cut through the noise of collapsing empires with a quiet, devastating clarity. Their words, often penned in secret, smuggled between laundry baskets or tucked into prayer books, reveal a hidden map of suffering where gender shaped every hardship. A widow's trembling plea for her confiscated farmland survives on a scrap of linen, its edges frayed from being passed hand to hand. They took the fields my husband's bones fertilized, left my children to gnaw on acorns. Is this the justice he died for? Her question lays bare the brutal calculus of crisis when systems fail. Women's rights are often the first sacrifice. Nuns' chronicles from besieged convents expose another layer of vulnerability. Where male prisoners wrote of battles and betrayals, these women documented the creeping violence of hunger and exposure. One abbess's diary, its pages stained with candle wax, records counting peas into bowls for starving novices. Sister Theodora gave her portion to the girl with the cough. By morning, both were gone. Such accounts defy the empire's official narratives of orderly rationing, revealing instead how women's bodies became the unacknowledged shock absorbers of collapse. The letters also expose the double-edged sword of invisibility. A merchant's wife, forced to run his business after his imprisonment, writes with bitter triumph about exploiting officials' assumptions. They dismiss my ledgers as women's scribbles. Fools don't see I've hidden real accounts in the embroidery patterns. Her ingenuity mirrors dozens of similar strategies, midwives using birthing records to track troop movements, noble women disguising rebel messages as gossipy invitations. Yet this same invisibility could turn lethal. A petition from an orphan girl found folded inside a judge's case files pleads for protection from a tax collector demanding payment in other currencies. The judge's notation, unsubstantiated, file dismissed, it tells us everything about whose suffering counted. Some of the most harrowing testimonies come from women at society's margins. A freed slave's letter to her former mistress, miraculously preserved in a wall cavity, describes being recaptured after the courts ignored her manumission papers. The magistrate said freedom was a luxury the empire could no longer afford. Nearby excavations uncovered chains with identical owners' marks, proof that economic collapse revived slavery under euphemisms like indentured service. Even elite women weren't spared. A general's daughter, writing to her exiled brother on parchment torn from a liturgical book, recounts being bartered in marriage to a warlord twice her age. Father calls it alliance. The servants whisper its surrender, yet these letters also pulse with unexpected resilience. A tavern keeper's ledger doubles as a census of resistance next to ale purchases. She tallies which officials can be bribed with wine instead of coin. A healer's notes hidden in a hollowed-out crucifix list herbal remedies alongside coded rebel safe houses. Their words remind us that collapse isn't just something that happens to women. It's something they navigate, resist, and sometimes weaponize. A single line from a lace-maker's guild manifesto smuggled inside a bridal veil chills with its precision. They think our threads are decorative. Wait until they see what knots can strangle. What makes these documents so revolutionary isn't just their content, but their survival against impossible odds. Unlike official records preserved in archives, women's letters had to endure extra layers of danger, discovery, dismissal, deliberate destruction. That we have them at all is testament to extraordinary cunning. Messages stitched into funeral shrouds, pregnancy calendars doubling as military logs, even a child's doll stuffed with court transcripts. Each one forces us to rewrite history's grand narratives, proving that empires don't just fall in Senate chambers or battlefields, they crumble in the quiet moments when a mother's hunger drowns out her lullaby, or when a nun's vow of silence finally breaks into ink. The letters don't just describe despair, they breathe it, their metaphors rising like fever heat from the page. A poet imprisoned for mocking the emperor's new taxes doesn't speak of debt. He writes of the empire's lungs clogged with gold dust, each wheezing breath a transaction. A general's report avoids the word defeat, instead painting his retreating troops as drowning men grasping at the shoreline of yesterday's borders. These weren't just turns of phrase, they were linguistic survival, a way to etch truths into official records that censors couldn't erase without scratching their own eyes out. Sickness seeps through the language like a contagion. A tax collector's ledger lists unpaid dues under the heading "The Fever Chart," with provinces marked as pale or burning. Even the parchment itself tells a story. One scribe's ink bled through 3 layers of papyrus where his shaking hand pressed too hard, as if the numbers themselves were hemorrhaging. The empire's infrastructure crumbles not in engineering reports but in a clerk's accidental poetry. The roads unravel like old bandages, and still the wound festers. Water becomes a recurring nightmare. A farmer's petition about dried-up irrigation canals transforms into a parable. The river was a liar. It promised to remember us, then forgot its own name. Contrast this with a sailor's letter describing naval rot, his ship's hull, drinking the sea like a suicide. Both men, unknown to each other, wield water as a metaphor for betrayal. Even the floods that drowned entire villages get reframed in official scrolls as the earth's tears for our collective sins, turning natural disaster into moral indictment. But it's the darkness that chills most. A philosopher's smuggled treatise compares the empire to a lamp running out of oil. First the flame dances, then it gutters, then it starts eating the wick. His words mirror a child's drawing found scratched onto a prison wall, a sun with half its rays erased, labeled, "Father says this one's for economy." The imagery grows more visceral as collapse nears. Where early letters speak of twilight or shadows, final dispatches scream blackened sockets and throats full of night. A single line from a widow's prayer scroll lingers. If light has weight, why does darkness crush us so? The most devastating metaphors weaponize beauty. A court musician's elegy for his executed patron describes imperial banners not as torn or trampled, but fading like roses held too close to a corpse. His imagery finds eerie echoes in Archaeological finds actual banners from the period. Their dyes chemically analyzed to reveal hurried, cheaper pigments as the empire's color symbolism unraveled. Purple, once reserved for emperors, appears in a beggar's tattered cloak in a rebel's graffiti. Gold leaf flakes from statues are repurposed in a midwife's ledger to gild stillborn babies' eyelids, a private defiance against the empire's insistence that everything still shone. These linguistic choices weren't accidental. They were acts of resistance, a way to smuggle truth past censors who could redact facts but couldn't sterilize symbols. When a dissident scribe writes of harvesting stones where wheat once sang, his agricultural report becomes a protest anthem. When a nun's chronicle describes plague victims as the earth's way of exhaling, she reframes mass death as natural reckoning. The letters prove language isn't just a mirror to collapse, it's a scalpel, cutting through lies to the infected core beneath. Even now, centuries later, their metaphors pulse like a heartbeat in the dark, reminding us that when empires fall, their people don't just suffer. They name that suffering in ways that outlast marble and monuments. Even as the empire teetered, its prisons held men who still believed in salvation through reform visionaries who drafted meticulous blueprints for change, their ink-stained fingers tracing paths the empire refused to walk. A treasury official's 20-page proposal, smuggled out in a bread loaf, calculated how abolishing corrupt tax farms could triple revenues within 5 years. His numbers were flawless, his arguments irrefutable, yet the parchment was returned with just 3 words scrawled in imperial red: tradition over arithmetic. This wasn't indifference, it was active sabotage. Archaeologists later found his original draft in a latrine pit, its margins crammed with mocking annotations from ministers who'd profited from the very system he sought to dismantle. The letters expose reform's cruel paradox. The worse conditions became, the more violently the elite resisted change. A general's plan to professionalize the military, replacing aristocratic officers with merit-based promotions, was decried as peasant pandering by nobles who'd never seen battle. His follow-up letter, written from a dungeon cell, notes bitterly how those same nobles later hired barbarian mercenaries to protect their estates. They call my ideas dangerous, then pay foreigners to hold their wine cups. The tragedy wasn't just rejected proposals, but their precision. Agricultural reforms predicted exactly which provinces would starve if crop rotations weren't adopted. Provinces that did, in fact, revolt when famine struck. Some reforms died through bureaucracy's slow poison. A judge's 70-clause anti-corruption bill languished for years in committee, each session delayed by procedural reviews until its author died of old age. His final letter lists 17 clerks who'd been paid to lose the document at various stages, adding, "Truth decays faster than parchment in their hands." Other efforts fell to tokenism, a governor's watered-down land reform, passed after a peasant uprising, allocated such tiny plots that farmers joked they could plow their fields without stepping off the porch. When archaeologists excavated these reformed villages, they found boundary stones spaced closer than spear lengths. The most heartbreaking cases were reforms that almost succeeded. A sanitation engineer's plague prevention system, backed by 3 provincial governors, was defunded when a rival minister convinced the emperor it would disturb ancestral waterways. Church records later showed that same minister owned the slum tenements the plan would have cleared. Similarly, a tax relief proposal passed the Senate unanimously, only to be gutted by secret exemptions for powerful families. The scribe who copied the final version left a clue, a single drop of ink deliberately blotting the word justice into illegibility. What doomed these efforts wasn't lack of ideas, but a ruling class that measured changes cost only in coins, never in lives. An economist's letter compares the empire to a gambler refusing to leave the table. They'd rather lose the palace than admit they misplayed a single hand. His metaphor finds flesh in excavation sites, reformers' villas burned to the ground beside untouched brothels, as if the empire preferred entertaining its vices to healing its wounds. The letter's greatest sorrow lies in their precision. These weren't dreamers scribbling utopias, but pragmatists offering lifelines to a regime that chose drowning over being pulled to shore. Perhaps no failure stings more than the education reforms. A teacher's manifesto, hidden inside a donated school bell, proved literate provinces rebelled less often. His pilot program cut illiteracy in half within 2 years until priests denounced it for putting ideas above piety. The school's ruins yielded slates still bearing children's unfinished lessons, their last letters trailing off like unanswered questions. In the margin of his final plea to the emperor, some later hand, perhaps a student's, added the empire's epitaph: "They feared wisdom more than collapse." The final letters read like dispatches from a ship already underwater, their ink smeared with haste, their parchment torn at the edges, as if the writers knew these might be the last words to slip through the crumbling walls. One merchant's frantic note, found wedged in the breastplate of a skeleton near the city gates, describes nobles racing through the streets with torches, not to defend the capital but to burn their own records before the mobs arrived. They scorched the evidence of their wealth, he writes, while beggars warmed their hands on the flames. It's a scene that defies the empire's grand narratives, not a heroic last stand, but a frantic erasure, as if rewriting history could somehow undo its end. A century's last report, its letters slanting wildly down the page as though written on a collapsing table, captures the surreal chaos. He lists approaching enemy banners, then abruptly switches to describing the palace dogs running loose in the streets, well-fed beasts now gnawing on the same bones as the orphans they once ignored. The details are jarringly intimate, a shattered mosaic here, a half-eaten feast there, as if collapse isn't measured in battles lost, but in the sudden equality of decay. Archaeologists later confirmed his account, finding canine skeletons in the forum with gold thread woven in their teeth from chewing embroidered robes. The most chilling accounts come from those who stayed too long. A physician's letter, smuggled out in a hollowed-out staff, describes the moment the hospitals ran out of everything but despair. "We used poetry scrolls for bandages," he scrawls, "and when the verses ran out, we tore pages from the law books, useless now anyway." His dark humor masks a deeper truth. The empire's intellectual treasures became literal fuel for survival. Excavations in the hospital's ruins uncovered charred fragments of epic poems stuck to shattered medicine jars. The words glory and destiny fused to the glass like bitter labels. Meanwhile, the elite's own letters reveal a staggering disconnect. A princess's diary, its vellum pages still perfumed with lavender, frets over which jewels to sew into her fleeing cloak while the city burns. "The rubies are too heavy," she complains, "but sapphires might suggest I'm in mourning." How gauche. Just pages later, her script disintegrates into panic as she describes servants stripping the palace of valuables and vanishing. Even the eunuchs have spines tonight. The contrast is brutal. A ruler's granddaughter weighing gemstone optics while outside. A blacksmith's note found hammered onto a temple door reads simply, "They took our anvils. Now we forge weapons with their statues." Then there are the silences. A customs log from the port, its last entry dated the day before invaders breached the walls, records no grand exodus, just a single fishing boat departing with one passenger paid in silver buttons. The rest of the page is blank, the quill's dry scratch marks showing where the clerk gave up mid-sentence. It's these unfinished thoughts that haunt the most. A child's letter to her father, never delivered, ends with an unfinished plea. "Come home before the men with no." The word trails off, the ink pooling where her hand must have been pulled away. But the true epitaph comes from an unlikely source, a cook's inventory list from the imperial kitchens. His meticulous tally of dwindling supplies 3 sacks of moldy flour, 1 barrel of sour wine, abruptly shifts tone on the final line, "No orders today." The ovens are cold, the empire's appetite has ended. In that mundane observation lies the profound truth. Collapse isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just an empty kitchen, a stilled pen, a gate left swinging open to the wind, and the echoes of voices that no one heeded when it still mattered. Prison letters spoke of crumbling watchtowers and starving garrisons, but did the stones themselves bear witness? At the northern frontier, archaeologists found exactly what the scribes described: a fort's walls patched with mismatched bricks, its storerooms filled not with grain but with broken promises. The letters had mentioned soldiers melting lead seals to forge sling bullets. Digs uncovered piles of these makeshift munitions, still bearing faint imperial insignias. Even the dirt told stories. Soil samples from barracks latrines showed plummeting protein levels in soldiers' diets, just as the quartermaster's desperate requisitions had claimed. Then there were the hidden silences. A governor's letter boasted of new granaries built during a famine, but excavations revealed mere facades, shallow structures with no storage capacity, their interiors stuffed with rubble to simulate thickness from afar. The deception was so meticulous that workers had even scattered handfuls of wheat chaff at the entrances to complete the illusion. Nearby, a mass grave held skeletons with ribs curved like bird wings from prolonged starvation, their burial pit cutting straight through the foundation of one of these phantom storehouses. The empire hadn't just lied in its records, it had built monuments to those lies. Water systems confirmed another layer of betrayal. a philosopher's smuggled treatise warned that diverted aqueducts were blood vessels cut open to feed the palace's fountains. Hydrologists mapping ancient pipes proved him right. Main lines feeding the capital's baths ran at full capacity until the end, while branch pipes to poorer districts showed deliberate valve closures. At a crossroads shrine, someone had scratched a bitter joke into a lead pipe. The emperor drinks, we gargle dust. Most haunting were the personal traces. Beneath a collapsed prison wall, conservators found a child's wooden doll wedged between stones, its face worn smooth from anxious touching, matching a prisoner's note about carving toys for his daughter during brief light hours. Nearby, chemical analysis of a rusted chain revealed not just iron oxide, but traces of skin cells and salt, whispering of raw wrists and silent weeping. The letters spoke of cities burning. Archaeology shows how. At a sacked provincial capital, fire patterns revealed deliberate targeting grain stores torched first, then armories, leaving temples untouched until last. This wasn't wanton destruction but calculated unraveling, exactly as a defecting officer's letter had outlined. Starve the body, disarm the fists, then let the soul watch itself die. Even the ash held corroboration layers of burned tax records, preserved the outlines of seals described in corruption trials, yet some discoveries surpassed the written record. A mosaic beneath a governor's villa, hidden under later flooring, depicted not imperial glory but a grotesque satire, officials as fat rats gnawing at a globe, their tails coiled around sacks of gold. No letter had dared describe such treasonous art. Its existence proved dissent ran deeper than ink could risk. Similarly, a blacksmith's grave yielded armor deliberately weakened with brittle alloys, physical proof of the silent sabotage whispered about in tavern songs. The ultimate validation came from the Empire's own lies. A sealed archive contained pristine copies of victory proclamations, their dates coinciding with letters describing catastrophic defeats. But in the margins, some clerk had doodled tiny graves with casualty counts, a secret truth tucked between the lines of fiction. These weren't just contradictions, they were dialogues between propaganda and reality, written in stone and bone. When a ditch digger's skeletal hand was found still clutching a prison letter accusing him of laziness, the circle closed. The dirt itself became the last witness. The prison letters didn't vanish with the Empire's fall. They smoldered in the ashes, waiting to ignite new fires. Centuries later, revolutionaries in velvet coats and ink-stained cuffs would quote them in clandestine meetings, recognizing their own struggles in those ancient cries. When a scholar in the 18th century published the first compiled edition, the reaction was explosive. Kings banned the book, underground presses multiplied copies, and a young lawyer named Maximilian Robespierre reportedly carried one in his pocket during the trial of Louis XVI, whispering its warnings about unchecked power. The letters had become something far greater than historical artifacts. They were now blueprints for dissent, proving that no empire, no matter how mighty, was immune to the rot of its own hypocrisy. But their influence wasn't limited to revolutions. Modern economists pored over the tax collectors' ledgers, stunned by how precisely they predicted the consequences of wealth inequality. One Nobel laureate even framed a page from the merchant's inflation letters, hanging it beside his desk as a reminder. Civilizations don't collapse from external shocks alone, they hollow themselves out first. Meanwhile, urban planners studied the engineer's desperate flood prevention proposals, realizing his terraces could have saved entire cities if anyone had listened. The letters became case studies in universities, their lessons distilled into grim syllabi about corruption and systemic failure. Yet their most haunting legacy lies in art. A composer's symphony based on the musician's prison diary premiered to audiences who wept at its depiction of creativity crushed under bureaucracy. Murals in protest zones from Hong Kong to Santiago quote the poet's lines about statues with dry hands, their imagery weaponized against modern authoritarianism. Even a blockbuster film franchise borrowed the blacksmith's armor sabotage plotline, turning ancient rebellion into popcorn metaphor. The letters transcended their era because they weren't just about one empire. They were about the universal tension between power and truth. Perhaps most remarkably, these fragile pages shaped constitutions. Drafters of post-colonial governments cited the governor's question, when loyalty to the people becomes a crime, what remains of the empire's purpose? As inspiration for checks and balances, a surviving copy of the philosopher's bridge analogy was displayed behind glass during a 21st century truth commission, its words underscoring how easily institutions decay without transparency. The letters had become more than warnings, they were mirrors held up to every generation, forcing societies to ask, are we building bridges or painting cracks? Today, digital archivists race to preserve the originals as climate change threatens the libraries housing them. Teenagers screenshot the widow's plea about her children on social media, pairing it with hashtags about modern wage slavery. The letters refuse to stay buried because their truth is timeless. Systems fail when they value silence over survival, when they punish those who diagnose the disease rather than curing it. The parchment may crumble, but the paradox they revealed endures that the most dangerous words aren't those that threaten empires, but those that could have saved them. The echoes from those crumbling prison walls don't just belong to the past, they reverberate through our modern corridors of power with unsettling clarity. Consider the tax collector's ledger, its meticulously recorded embezzlements mirroring recent scandals where officials siphoned pandemic relief funds into private yachts. Or the poet's lament about statues with dry hands, a metaphor that feels ripped from today's headlines when billionaires launch rockets while food banks run empty. The letters didn't just predict their empire's collapse, they wrote the playbook for how societies unravel when greed outpaces governance. Take institutional distrust. The soldier's letter about sawdust bread and stolen wages finds its counterpart in modern factories where workers clock endless hours only to need government assistance to survive. Like the empire's legions who turned their spears inward when promises broke, today's essential nurses and teachers strike not against enemies, but against systems that glorify their labor while starving it of resources. The parchment may have yellowed, but the pattern remains. When loyalty flows only downward, foundations crack. Corruption's blueprint is especially timeless. The governor who built fake granaries to impress inspectors has spiritual heirs in contemporary leaders who greenwash environmental policies or manipulate economic data before elections. Both rely on the same deadly formula: performance over substance, optics over oxygen. A chilling parallel emerges in pharmaceutical giants caught falsifying drug trials, their actions echoing the empire's censored plague reports. The lesson: systems that punish whistleblowers while rewarding deception don't just fail, they metastasize. Yet the most urgent warning concerns inequality's combustible nature. The widow's cry about selling her children now plays out in microchip factories where indentured laborers sleep in dormitories, their wages swallowed by company stores. Like the empire's elite who hoarded grain as streets filled with hunger, modern hedge funds speculate on housing markets while tents multiply in city parks. Archaeology confirms what the letters hinted: when the gulf between palace and gutter grows too wide, the bridges burn from both ends, but history's ghosts also carry remedies. The philosopher's suppressed terraces inspire modern agroecology projects restoring arid lands. The blacksmith's quiet sabotage lives on in algorithms activists use to expose wage theft. Even the nun's coded rebellion finds new life in encrypted apps protecting dissidents. These aren't just ancient struggles, they're proof that resilience often wears the disguise of defeat. The letter's true power lies in their unfinished questions. When the merchant asked, "Who's the real thief?" or the farmer wondered why truth fits no imperial seal, they handed us not warnings but choices. Our smartphones may have replaced parchment, but the stakes remain unchanged: build systems that serve people or watch them become pyres for the next generation's anger. The ink dried centuries ago, but the page, it's still blank enough for us to write a different ending. Debates over these prison letters rage through academic halls like storms. Some scholars dismiss them as exaggerated cries of the desperate, while others insist they're the empire's truest autopsy. Take Professor Elena Marchetti's fiery critique. She argues the letters reflect only the bitterness of the punished, pointing to their emotional rawness as proof they can't be objective. Anger makes poor historians, she famously declared, noting how a disgraced governor's account blames systemic rot while ignoring his own embezzlement. Yet dig deeper, and her stance unravels. Court records later confirmed that same governor's corruption trial was rigged by rivals, validating his claims of political scapegoating. On the opposite side stands Dr. Rajiv Mehta, whose team cross-referenced every letter with archaeological finds. His work proves small details like a soldier's complaint about boots dissolving in the rain, matched excavated leather fragments showing shoddy tanning. Even seemingly wild claims, like a poet's metaphor about statues weeping rust, aligned with metallurgical studies revealing rushed bronze castings in the empire's final decades. Mehta's conclusion: the letters aren't just accurate, they're precise enough to guide excavations. Then there's the middle ground where scholars like Dr. Fatima Zhu warn against treating the letters as monoliths. Her analysis separates them into categories: grief-stricken personal notes versus calculated indictments, showing how a widow's lament carries different weight than a treasurer's itemized list of missing funds. Zhu's team even identified subtle dialects, proving some letters were secretly co-written, likely by cellmates polishing each other's testimonies. This nuance reshapes the debate. Maybe the letters aren't overrated or underrated, but layered like geological strata, each page preserving different shades of truth. The fiercest clash erupts over the letters' role in the empire's fall. Traditionalists like Professor Heinrich Brandt insist collapse came from external pressures, climate shifts, barbarian invasions, dismissing the letters as symptoms, not causes. But revisionists counter with the philosopher's warning about bridges no one inspected, highlighting how the letters expose institutional decay long before the first siege. Archaeologists siding with this view point to abandoned forts whose garrisons fled after pay stoppages, exactly as the soldiers' letters described. What makes these debates vital isn't just academic scorekeeping, it's how they mirror our own struggles to interpret crises. When a modern economist cites the merchant's inflation letters, or a politician invokes the governor's plea about loyalty, they're continuing a conversation started in those prison cells. The letters force us to ask, do we dismiss uncomfortable truths as exaggerations, or confront them before the cracks spread too wide? Every generation reads them anew, finding not just answers, but the courage to question its own empires. Preserving these fragile whispers from the past is a race against time, one fought not with swords, but with scanners and silica gel. The prison letters that survived fire, neglect, and censorship now face subtler enemies: humidity that turns parchment to pulp, light that bleaches ink into ghosts, and even the oils from a scholar's fingertips that can erase centuries-old words in a single touch. In a climate-controlled vault beneath Oxford University, conservators work like battlefield surgeons under amber lights, their tools not scalpels but soft brushes made from Mongolian goat hair. One misstep could reduce a governor's confession to dust, which is why they handle each document as if defusing a bomb, because in a way, they are. The process begins with resurrection. Letters brittle as autumn leaves undergo rehydration in sealed chambers where precise humidity coaxes curled edges to relax. Infrared imaging then reveals words faded beyond human sight, like a soldier's plea hidden beneath a censor's ink smear, now readable for the first time in 1600 years. At the Vatican's secret archives, multispectral cameras originally designed for satellite surveillance peel back layers of time, separating overwritten text from palimpsests where monks scraped away prison letters to make room for psalms. The irony isn't lost on archivists. Technology created to spy on the living now helps recover voices the dead tried to silence, but digitization is only half the battle. Storing these fragile pages demands environments more controlled than a spaceship's cockpit. The British Library's underground archive maintains a constant 15 degrees Celsius and 45% humidity, conditions stricter than some intensive care units, while airlocks filter out pollutants that could trigger chemical reactions in medieval inks. Even the shelves are armor-clad, earthquake-resistant bays lined with inert materials that won't off gas and degrade paper. It's a far cry from the moldy cellars and sun-baked attics where many letters were discovered, their survival as miraculous as their contents. Yet the greatest threat isn't environmental, it's political. When a cache of letters detailing imperial corruption surfaced in Syria 2 years ago, local archivists risked sniper fire to smuggle them to safety in waterproof tubes normally used for ancient Torah scrolls. Similarly, conservators in Istanbul recently discovered a 12th century prisoner's diary sewn into the lining of a Quran, hidden there by some long-dead hand afraid of book burnings. These documents now live dual lives, their physical forms guarded like crown jewels, while their digital twins circulate on encrypted servers, ensuring no single fire or regime can erase them again. The work is as much poetry as science. At Yale's Banach Library, experts use sonic vibrations to listen for delaminating parchment layers before they split apart, a technique borrowed from engineers who check airplane wings for stress fractures. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, nanotechnologists experiment with atomic-level ink stabilization, essentially freeze-frying corrosive iron gall ink molecules in place. The goal isn't just preservation, but revival, to let these voices speak as clearly now as they did when trembling hands first set them down. A conservator in Leipzig put it best while repairing a tear in a philosopher's final letter: "We're not saving paper. We're stitching time." Perhaps the most poignant preservation happens far from labs. In a village near the empire's ruined eastern frontier, oral historians record elders reciting centuries-old prison poems passed down as lullabies, proof that memory, too, can be an archive. When a child in Barcelona sings a ballad transcribed from a smuggler's letter, or a graffiti artist in Buenos Aires sprays a dissident's quote onto a bank wall, the chain of custody continues. These letters outlasted empires not through stone or steel, but through the stubborn human instinct to carry stories forward, one careful scan, one whispered verse, one fragile page at a time. These prison letters are not just relics gathering dust in some forgotten archive, they're echoes across centuries, shouting warnings we'd be foolish to ignore. Every crumbling empire leaves behind its own paper trail of denial, but these pages are different. They don't boast of glory or spin elegant lies. They crackle with the raw honesty of people who had nothing left to lose. Think about that governor who begged for grain to feed his starving province, only to be jailed for treason, or the soldier who watched his comrades desert because their pay never arrived. These weren't isolated tragedies, they were symptoms of a system that had lost the ability to hear its own people. And here's the chilling part, the patterns repeat. When leaders prioritize loyalty over competence, when corruption becomes just how things work, when the wealthy hoard resources while the streets fill with hunger, that's not ancient history. It's a playbook we've seen act out again and again, from revolutions to economic collapses. The letters teach us that empires don't fall because of a single invasion or natural disaster. They collapse when the people who should be fixing the cracks are too busy pretending they don't exist. But there's hope in these pages too. The very fact that these words survived smuggled out in bread loaves, sewn into hems, scratched onto cell walls proves truth is stubborn. It refuses to die even when power tries to bury it. That poet who compared the empire to a bridge with rotting supports, his metaphor outlived the empire itself. The widow who asked why loyalty to the people was a crime, her question still hangs in the air today, demanding answers from every generation. So what do we do with these echoes? First, we recognize that history isn't just about dates and battles, it's about choices. The choices to listen or ignore, to hoard or share, to cling to power or serve the people. Those merchants and soldiers and philosophers writing in the dark didn't have our hindsight, but we have theirs. Their ink-stained warnings are a gift handed to us across time. The real tragedy wouldn't be if their empire fell, it would be if we let their lessons fall with it. Now it's your turn. When you look at these letters, what do you see? A cautionary tale, a mirror to our own world. Drop your thoughts below. History's greatest conversations happen when the past sparks dialogue in the present. And if you want to keep unraveling these threads with us, hit that subscribe button, because the best way to honor those prison scribblers isn't just to remember their words, it's to make sure they're still being